On this edition of All Hands Television, we look at the history of underway replenishment. We join sailors embarked aboard USNS John Lenthal, and we look into the future of wheeled vehicles. And now, your host, Petty Officer Kat Smith.
In the days of sail, a ship could travel as far as its stores of hardtack and potable water allowed. Its fuel was the wind. After our Civil War, with the advent of steam-powered vessels, the range of a ship was defined by its ability to hold tons of coal in its holds. The ability to supply a navy across distant oceans became a problem for our naval leaders during the Spanish-American War and the voyage of the Great White Fleet 100 years ago. For those of us used to seeing oilers pull up alongside aircraft carriers to deliver millions of pounds of jet fuel, or to having helos drop pallets of food on the deck, resupply is a natural event. Sergeant Phil Grondin sat down with naval historian and author Thomas Wildenberg to get an understanding of how underway replenishment came about.
The history of refueling at sea goes back to the Spanish-American War, where the fleet off of Cuba had to be refueled, and it was done by colliers in a protected harbor. So it really predates even the Great White Fleet. And of course, the whole emphasis of refueling at sea is to avoid the necessity of steaming back to base to refuel.
In 1907, the Great White Fleet left Norfolk and sailed around the world.
In order to get fleet around the world, the Navy actually had to leave a whole flotilla of colliers to precede the fleet and be in harbor so that the fleet could be refueled. The big lesson that was learned was the need for logistic support. It's not generally known that all of these colliers that supported the fleet, most of them were leased from Great Britain because the Navy had one or two of its own colliers. Not enough colliers, not enough fuel ships to support the fleet.
When the U.S. entered World War I, the Navy decided to send several squadrons of destroyers to England to help in the fight against the German submarine fleet.
But there was a big problem in that only one squadron of the destroyers that the Navy had in its fleet could actually steam across the Atlantic. All the other destroyers did not have enough range. Fortunately, through the efforts of several naval officers, one of whom was Chester Nimitz, the crew of the MAUMEE, which was the second oiler that the Navy acquired, on its own initiative had developed a method of transferring fuel by hose from one ship to another. So that when war came, very fortuitously, the MAUMEE had this capability, and she was positioned in mid-Atlantic to help these destroyers move from the United States to England. And this was the first operational use of refueling at sea. After World War I, the Navy continued to perfect the technique, primarily of better methods of refueling destroyers at sea.
During the Great Depression, Congress appropriated funds to subsidize the building of 12 tankers. At the end of the 1930s, a Pacific War was clearly on the horizon.
When war came, we were very fortunate that these 12 tankers were available and were immediately converted for Navy use. So that when Pearl Harbor occurred in December 7th, the United States already had perfected the means of refueling its aircraft carriers, and it was already converting these 12 tankers into fleet oilers. So that in the first 6 months of the war, the Navy was able to supply modern tankers to escort these carriers as they roamed the Pacific, striking back at the Japanese fleet.
There are many strategic advantages to underway replenishment.
You could extend the range of ships. They no longer had to go back to base to refuel. Tactically, you could keep the ships on the move so that they were less likely to attack from submarine or later by aerial attack. And then thirdly, they could continue to steam towards their destination without losing time. At the end of World War II, as one of the reparations, the United States Navy acquired a German ship by the name of the Ditmarsson. And the Ditmarsson was one of the first what's called underway replenishment ships. She was designed and built by the German Navy to replenish their ships at sea, and she had the capability of supplying all of the needs of a ship at sea: oil, ammunition, and supplies. And she was taken into the U.S. Navy and renamed the Conoco. And she was used as the first ship in the U.S. Navy to perfect the simultaneous transfer of fuel and ammunition. And this was an evolutionary process that really had its beginnings in World War I. It's one of the great logistic achievements of the United States Navy, something that set it apart from all other navies in the world, that its constant development and refinement of first coaling at sea, then refueling at sea, until now we have underway replenishment at sea.
Keeping ships forward deployed and ready to carry out assigned missions requires us to remain able to not only fuel and supply ships at sea, but to do it better than anyone else. Since its founding in 1970, that role has been the domain of the Military Sealift Command. After the break, All Hands Television will be back with a unique look at an MSC deployment.
To most of us, there's an obvious difference between this and this. Unfortunately, some feel it's okay to pick up the pace if you're late for work, or trying to catch a movie, or late for a meeting with your new commanding officer. The reality is, there's no good excuse for speeding. There's a time and a place for speed. City streets aren't it.
Imagine doing this without a helmet. Did you realize that the impact sustained in an accident at 40 miles an hour is 20 times more devastating? Imagine doing that without a helmet. It's estimated an additional 640 motorcyclists would survive crashes each year if bikers would simply wear their helmets. Think about that the next time you ride.